difficulties. We know it's a very difficult path. There's joy and sorrow for all of us. And I think what I was trying to explore is the different viewpoints.
Faith at the Fringe, a Sanctuary First podcast series. Uncovering God in the creative arts. At the biggest international arts festival in the world, Sanctuary First stops to ask, where does faith and art meet?
And welcome to Faith at the Fringe, a Sanctuary First podcast that seeks to engage with creatives and musicians and actors at the Edinburgh International Fringe Festival. I'm Albert Bogle, and I'm joined by my colleague, Rob Rawson, and together we're going to be interviewing members of the cast that's running the play in the festival just now called When Thora Hird Met Kurt Cobain. And it's interesting that we've got with us the writer of the play, which is Clara Haddon, who's with us. And we also have one of we've got Thora Hird herself, which is in fact Kellie Gamble. And so we're going to enjoy having a conversation with you. And I know that Kurt Cobain is actually Anthony Hopkinson.
That's right, yeah.
But he's not with us.
No.
But we've got all we need with the pair of you being
Too busy
here
getting
today.
his eyeliner on.
Yeah. So listen, it's such an interesting thought. When I was looking through the menus, you might say, or the program for the Fringe, I saw this and I thought, wow, we need to get these people on, if we can, to talk to them about this conversation. So what made you think about this idea?
The original idea came from listening to Kurt Cobain singing, Jesus, don't want me for a sunbeam. Jesus, don't want me for a sunbeam. Sunbeams are not made like me. So it's a take on a traditional Christian hymn, Jesus wants me for a sunbeam. And it was kind of going round in my head, this idea of subverting a traditional Christian hymn, which originally I think was produced by a band called the Vaseline, so I think might be Scottish actually. So I had this idea of maybe playing around with it. Initially it was just the song, and I was aware of the Christian hymn, which was written about 1900 I think, and I thought how interesting would it be to contrast his take on that with someone of faith. And immediately I thought of Thora Hird because she was a lifelong Christian and Methodist. And I had the idea that probably she would be someone that would have sung that song in Sunday school. So it kind of started with that. Two very different people, very different lives, very different upbringings. And it kept going around in my head. And when I have an idea to write, I know that I will write it if it won't go away. So it kind of stuck and it went from there. And then obviously developed the idea of the play about these two very disparate people who on the surface seem not to have anything in common. But like most human beings, if you scratch the surface, actually there is a lot in common.
Well, I'll sing back to you. A sunbeam, Jesus wants me for a sunbeam, a sunbeam, a sunbeam. I'll be a sunbeam for him.
That's right.
And of course, you've taken that. And it's actually, this is going to be a very interesting podcast, folks, because we're going to use this to be like the little boat that will take us through the life of this particular conversation. And we're going to be exploring things like things that are about faith and belief. We're going to be exploring things like death and loss, but fame and the pitfalls of fame. And we're going to be thinking about home life and what's missing when a family breaks up. So there's a whole lot going on in this podcast, and we hope that you, our listeners, will find yourself drawn into it, because already I find myself fascinated to this in this conversation. So I'm going to now go over to you, Kellie, and just say, what's it like trying to play a national treasure?
Very intimidating. Yeah. When Clara first asked me, my first thought was, I can't do it. But actually, I've grown to absolutely adore Thora Hird. Lots and lots of watching her old films and the old footage. And I just think she was the most wonderful, wonderful woman. So funny, so sort of down to earth, but just with real soul, I think. She's just lovely. So actually, I've grown. I love playing her, and I think I quite enjoy. I'm only 46. I quite enjoy sort of embodying somebody who's older and very different. And then when I come off stage, people not necessarily knowing it was me. It's people go, hang on a minute. Yeah, so I enjoy that.
Yeah. So in doing this, have you had to do a lot of rehearsals in trying to get into Thora's mindset so that you can engage with it? And is that changing the way you're thinking?
Yeah, because she is a very grounded, very positive woman, and I think you can't help but for that to seep through into your own outlook. I think it's really helped me by following this process through to take on some more of that. I think I'm probably more naturally quite an anxious person, probably more like Kurt, and this has kind of really helped me. Even before we go on stage, I find myself channeling Thora with my nerves and things, and just sort of finding that inner calm that I don't know where that's come from really, but so it must be her.
The thing about I always thought about Thora Hird was it reminded me of my gran.
Yes.
She reminded me of gran, my aunties. She was just sort of, that's a funny thing to say, but she was very normal.
Really
now, I
normal.
grew up in the north, so, and she was from Morecambe, wasn't she? So
yeah, she was.
She was just sort of like the lady next door.
Very normal, and she talks about that in the play, that she feels that she's lucky and that she's normal.
Yeah.
I think that comes across, and she sort of revels in that a little bit. She likes the fact that she hasn't ever tried to be anything more than she is, and also I think, obviously she's been playing mothers and grandmothers all her life, and again she's quite proud of that she sort of comes across as everybody's mother or grandmother or yeah.
But it asks the question though, what is normal?
Absolutely, yeah. Who knows?
Clara, can I go over to you now and think about, as you were putting this together, this conversation, why did you? It's almost a conversation. It's about how you make sense of life for someone, and you've got someone here in Thora Hird who has got something that's helping her, a lens that she's looking through that's helping her see what life means, and so she's, you might say, a grounded Christian in Methodism, which no doubt she would have been brought up with Bible study and rooted in the importance of song. In fact, a lot of the songs that she would sing, she would understand her theology, because the Wesley songs were just full of theology. We sing that song, Hark the Herald Angels Sing, and then you look at the theology in it. Mild he lays his glory by, born that man no more may die, born to raise us sons of earth, born to give us second birth. All that theology packed in hymns that she'd have known to sing. And then Kurt, who's someone who was baptized a Christian, but I believe had a happy life up to about a 9-year-old, and then things went wrong. So how were you bringing that together to What bits of faith were you wanting them to be talking about?
And I think all of us are exploring, aren't we? That's what life is, I think. And particularly if you're a curious individual, you kind of want to experience life at its fullest. But life is very difficult, as we know. It's a very difficult path. There's joy and sorrow for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I was trying to explore is the different viewpoints, in the sense that they were very different, but they were also very similar. So she was lucky in a sense because she was grounded in faith from being a child. She knew nothing else. In fact, she says, I got off at the first tram stop at Methodism. And that's how I see faith to some extent, because it's very, very attractive, I think, faith. It helps people a lot if you can embrace it, if you're fortunate enough to be able to do that, irrespective of what that religious faith is. For me personally, I can't do that. I kind of sometimes think, well, I'd really like to succumb, but I just can't, because for whatever reason, it won't allow me to. Maybe I've got too many questions. So I think Kurt was exploring, but he couldn't get off at the first tram stop. He was baptised as a child. He lived with a Christian family as a teenager. And he says every day was like Sunday, and I was a holy boy. And I think he revelled in that, revelled in the purity of that, but it didn't last, because he'd got these, if you like, I don't like to use the word demons, but he'd got these questions. He was a normal young man. He was a teenager. He was going to experiment anyway. But he was pulled all his life, I think, between, as we all are to some extent, different forces. So for her, faith was simple, really. For him, it was more complicated. But that doesn't mean that she didn't have difficult times. I discovered in researching her life that she'd lost her older sister. Her parents' first child, Olga, was run over when she was 6 years old on Morecambe Promenade. And in the play, we touch on that. We have the voiceover of Thora's mother talking about the loss of a child, and the church ceremony where the Salvation Army and the Methodist congregation do actually sing your version of Jesus Wants Me for a Sunbeam. But the faith enabled Thora's mother not to become bitter, I think, whereas other people might struggle more with that. And interestingly, just to say, to add to that, Kurt really wanted a family, but was terrified of the potential loss of a child. So that's kind of one of the themes that is borne out in the play, what it means to love and lose or fear loss. So they were both seekers, I think we're all seekers, but she just had this rock of faith, and he was more...
Well, I think you're so perceptive in what you're saying here today. I think these podcasts have been very, very powerful. And I really thank you for coming here today to talk about this, because in doing this, in some way you are talking about your own understanding of how people find faith. And also I admire your honesty in saying, it's not for me, but it's not for you. This is coming from my perspective as someone who is trying to point people to faith, say, just yet. Because I think faith is not something I think it's something it's uncovered, it's revealed. It's like a revelation, the cover. It's always there, but it's uncovered and you see it. You go, wow, right, I get it now. But what you're doing is wonderful, because you're seeking and you're turning over stones and you're helping people to come to terms with something, because there will be people listening to this podcast today and they'll be saying, Clara, that's exactly where I am. And I know people like Thora Hird, but I also know people like Kurt. And I would I know where I would like to be, but how do I get there? And I think that's the area that we're going to be exploring more today, in this podcast. So thank you for that wonderful answer. Thank you.
And talking of exploring, I mean, there are a lot of issues that I know, Albert, you touched on it a little bit earlier, but there are lots of things that were discussed in the conversation, like Eastern religions and Methodism, family life. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the things they talk about?
Yeah, so obviously one of the main topics, although I wouldn't say it's exclusive, is the discussion around faith.
Yeah.
So he asks her about, initially, because she's dressed as a Salvation Army officer, Captain Emily Ridley from the series Hallelujah, he asks her if she's, a sister, and she says no. And then she says that she's a Methodist, and he asks her about Methodism, what do Methodists believe? And then he talks a little bit about his baptism, which I've touched on. But then he says he's kind of not lost faith, but he's looked at Buddhism since then. So he said, I watched a couple of documentaries on Buddhism. Recently, I've got into Jainism. So in 1991, at this time that the play is set, he started looking at Jainism, which I don't know a huge amount about, but I know it's an Eastern religion. And he says they even have hospitals for animals, including pigeons. And you can see he kind of really gets excited about this concept of, a hospital for pigeons. And then they talk about the Beatles album, the Sgt. Pepper's album. And she is referenced on that in, is it A Day in the Life, Kellie? I can't remember now. Or is it Good Morning?
Good Morning.
Good Morning. So it says Time for Tea and Meet the Wife. Well, Meet the Wife was a series in the 60s which Thora Hird was in. So again, it was coincidental that he loved the Beatles and she happened to be referenced in one of the songs. But of course, the Beatles were going through their Eastern phase, their Indian phase, with the Sgt. Pepper album. So they there's a kind of slight reference to Eastern religion, but also music, which they both loved.
Yeah.
And they have a little sing-along together to one of the songs. But in addition to faith, they talk about family, love, love of a partner. She had a very, very devoted husband called Scotty and a daughter, Jeanette Scott, who was an actress.
She's still with us, isn't she? Yeah.
She's still with us, and she had grandchildren. And he obviously was in love with Courtney Love, and they did have a child before he died called Francis. So there are lots of things that they have in common, not just this exploration of faith.
Kellie, I wonder if I could ask you a question. What bit of the conversation do you enjoy most playing?
That's a really hard question, actually.
Well, I thought you'd just come out and say, this is a bit...
I mean, I don't want to give too much away, but there's a great bit at the start where she recounts an anecdote during the war that's to do with the menu of the rationed food that's available and a typo. That's all I'm going to say about that, because you'll have to come and see the show if you want to know what that's about. And I think the other thing that I loved, the other bit I love is when she talks about the night she meets her husband, and they dance at the Morecambe Winter Gardens. And she sort of conjures this picture of them. He's in his coattails. She's got a swanky dress on, and he's bought her some perfume, and she feels like a princess because she's very self-deprecating. So she doesn't see herself. She never saw herself as a great beauty, but she talks about how that night she felt beautiful. And again, sort of that unconditional love in their marriage. That she feels she's completely and utterly grounded and stable and trusting that she's got this partner who is her rock, and what a nice feeling that must be. Not everybody ever finds that. So that's really lovely. So they're probably my two favourite bits.
That sounds great. I mean, that ties in so much too with one of the themes that we've been doing in Sanctuary First this month is habitats of hope and a place where you can feel secure and feel loved. And of course, one of the things we're trying to get people to begin to go back, because often people who come onto our site and are part of our community aren't always church-carrying, card-attending people, right? So but they're seeking to live out faith rather than go to church. They're wanting to live church. And one of the things we are trying to encourage people to see is how much they're loved by God. And if you know how much you're loved by God, it grounds you. And I think that's what was coming over to me as you were talking about Thora and her love and unconditional love, because she'd been taught about unconditional love in her faith. And so the idea that God accepts us as we are. I think that's a lovely idea that God accepts us as well. He doesn't say, you've got to get better before I can love you, before. He accepts us, and that's something about the generosity of God that reaches out in these conversations. So I'm enjoying hearing you speak, and then I'm enjoying trying to make, as a preacher within me, I'm trying to make these faith links, which I hope you don't mind me doing, because it's just interesting to see how that's been drawn out. The other area you're talking about is fame and the potential pitfalls. Clara, you were talking about how you thought Kurt was aware of that. He was quite...
Yeah, I think he was. He'd always sought fame because he recognised that music was probably the only way out for him. He was from Aberdeen, which is a grey coastal town up on the northwest Pacific, fairly near to Seattle, very kind of nondescript. He loved music from a child. He loved the Beatles. He used to sing along to Alvin and the Chipmunks cartoon when he got his first guitar. He lived and breathed guitar. He was a left-handed guitarist, self-taught, very talented. So he knew that music was the way out, and he was desperate in a way for recognition, fame possibly not so. So he got involved eventually in the Seattle grunge scene with bands like the Vaselines, Mudhoney, etc., etc. And it took them a while to break, but they did eventually. And he was very driven by that. They were very, very poor, no gas for the car, living on people's floors, settees, etc., etc. But eventually they got their break. And where the Players set in 1991, they'd just finished their first European tour, and they'd had a great time. His band members, Dave and Chris, were really supportive, and he'd enjoyed the summer tour around Europe. It was just after the release of Nevermind. Is that the right album?
Yeah.
I can't remember. Yeah. Nevermind. So they were becoming famous. So literally, when he speaks to Thora, he's on the cusp. But even in the play, he's questioning, do I really want this? He's kind of reached this stage of recognition, but he quotes William Burroughs and, the money-eating machine. He recognises that fame is very, very dangerous. And he says to Thora, I don't ever want to be fake. And he quotes Freddie Mercury. He says, I'm not Freddie Mercury. I don't live for the adoration. So he's very conflicted about it, but I think he knows, he's got prescience that all will not end well, because he's already obviously started drug use. He had a terrible stomach condition. He was in agony, so I think opiates he used a lot for the pain. But yeah, he'd craved fame all his life, but when it actually arrived, I think he realised that it was going to be difficult. He wanted to be authentic. I think
it's the tension between, he was ultimately an introvert. It's that tension that I think a lot of performers have. Like, you hear it, I think, a lot with comedians. Quite often they're very introverted, but on stage they have to be performers. And I think that's always a very, interesting tightrope to walk when that's not your natural place. So when that then you've got that, and then there's adoration coming back at you, I imagine it's very addictive, but also quite scary and completely against what your natural character is when you're somebody who's maybe a little bit more.
It's interesting that your show is set is it the night before Nirvana appeared on Top of the
It's
Pops?
the very evening.
That very evening, which
Yeah.
is, of course, when that fame came, because that
Yes.
was quite something. I
Yeah,
mean,
so he was-
a lot of
he
people
said-
remember that performance, which was
Yeah.
live.
He's literally on the cusp.
Yeah.
So it's set in one of the green rooms, and it's a meeting between Thora, who's just come from filming, and he's preparing to go on Top of the Pops.
Right.
Yeah.
Did this conversation create within you a sense of compassion for Kurt?
Definitely.
And is that being worked out again in your own? I mean, I know it's just you're starting this, but is it learning it, and what, because you had to spend hours learning lines and becoming aware of it? Do you enter into that, or do you just take it as a line you've got to learn, or just compassion as you try to enact it out? Do you feel it?
I'd like to think I'm quite a compassionate person anyway. I mean, I work for a homeless charity in my day job, and I'm quite a sort of giving person, and I grew up in the church, and so I think it probably tapped into that. I've never had children, but I definitely, you feel maternal. That feeling of sort of being a bit concerned about somebody, and because I am the older cast member, so there is that parallel in that, I'm looking after Anthony as well, like he forgot his towel, so I've lent him a towel, things like that. So I think that, it was quite funny, because there are some parallels where you're sort of, definitely. You do live through it and see that. And it's interesting, because we had an audience member yesterday that said they'd come because they were a fan of Thora, had never really, hadn't really liked Kurt Cobain or Nirvana, but having watched the show, they were like, actually, I think I might think differently about him now. So clearly that's coming through, that sense of through his struggles and things and his humanity, that's coming across, and people are maybe understanding him more, but also there's a sense that she's bringing that out of him, and I like to think that that's something I try and do as well.
Talking about another area that you go into in the discussion, I believe you talk about death and loss, and there is, in talking with you, Kellie, and or because I think you're Thora now. I mean, you're making me think I'm speaking to Thora.
That was love.
But in thinking about this, it got me aware of, we're now coming to a point of sadness in all of this, and it touches me to think Van Gogh, who was a great artist, but never sold, I think he only sold one painting in his life, and he said to his brother at the end of his life, the sadness won't go away. And I wonder if there's a hint, could there be a parallel, could there be a hint of that, Clara, in your mind when you were writing this, of the sadness that was in this man who was on the curse of fame, but not sure that he wanted it?
Yeah, I mean, he talks about the suicide gene, the Cobain suicide gene, because his paternal grandfather's brothers all died at their own hand. There were 4 boys, 4 lads. And his mother's grandfather died in an asylum. He actually he'd got a stomach wound, and he pulled it open and he bled to death. So there was a feeling, potentially, that there was a kind of almost inevitability. I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with that, but there was definitely a feeling that there was a strong propensity towards, potential suicide. But I think he did have that sadness and just couldn't, for whatever reason, throw it off. Although in the play, we tried to bring out his sense of humour. He has a playfulness, and if you watch some of the footage of him on YouTube, he's got a beautiful smile. And Thora describes him as a Botticelli angel. She says, "I can't stop looking at you." He's a real sort of charisma there and almost like childish quality to him. So I've tried to bring out the joy, the potential joy, but inevitably I think you're left with this feeling of inevitable sadness, whereas Thora, who was also known loss, is able to kind of bounce back in a sense, you know, that she believes in heaven. She believes she's going to see her mother and her little sister again in heaven. And she's committed to that. So although she experiences sadness, she has faith. And I'm not saying that faith allows you to necessarily have a better life, but it gives you that comfort. You're talking about this habitat of hope, of home. And she had that, and I don't think he did.
If someone was wanting to come along to the show, where would they find it and what are the times?
It's on between the 14th and 19th of August at 5:05 at Space Venues, Surgeons Hall, Theatre 2.
Listen, I'm just looking, do you know what, our time's up.
Oh.
And we've had a great time. It's a great conversation. And I'm sure our viewers and listeners will find this a fascinating insight into the life of Kurt and Thora. And so today we want to thank you for looking in and ask you if you're able to give us your comments and your thoughts, because we would like to see what they are. And I'm quite sure that Clara and Kellie will have a look too and might even answer some of your questions. If you're intrigued, if there's a question that you've got that we didn't ask, but you would like to ask, then please put it on the chat line and have a conversation with us about it. We'd love to hear from you. But it leaves for me, all that's left for me is to thank Rob for his questions and to thank Clara for coming along and also to thank you, Kellie, for being part of our podcast today. And above all now, we want to thank you and also remind you that this podcast can be seen on most of the platforms, especially Spotify and iTunes, and you can also see it on Facebook. You can download our app, our Sanctuary First app, from one of the shops where you can do it online, or you can go onto our website at www.sanctuaryfirst.org.uk and you'll get a link there to download the app. So thank you again for joining us. Look forward to you being with us for our next podcast. Until then, God bless.